Story 1. I always think that the worst is going to happen. My parents tend to panic a lot, and whenever something occurs, they always assume the worst. Growing up, I realized that not everyone reacts in that way. I used to think it was normal to panic and assume the worst, as that was the only behavior I had observed while I was little. Now, I am working to change this behavior. Story 2. My father's bad temper and impatience make it challenging to live with him, so I am making an effort to change my own behavior. Story 3. My dad was always very generous with money, especially when it came to paying for meals with his friends. However, he would often bring it up later saying, "I can't believe I paid for that. They didn't even offer to pay." I try to ensure that I pay for things willingly when I've offered to, and that I don't expect anything in return. However, sometimes I catch myself complaining about treating someone, and I dislike it when that happens. Story 4. Being a people pleaser has held me back more in life than anything else. I was made to believe that my wants, interests, and needs are secondary to everyone else's. This also led me to believe that the worst possible outcome in every scenario is inevitable, no matter how unlikely it is or how irrational it sounds. Story 5. Catastrophic thinking, or overthinking in general, involves envisioning a series of negative outcomes. For example, if one event occurs, it could lead to another, resulting in an overall negative situation. Story 6. Disordered eating can result from forcing a child to eat until they vomit and then punishing them for doing so. This behavior can cause significant harm to their relationship with food. Story 7. Anxiety from my mom is annoying because the rest of me isn't like that. I feel it and think, what do I do? It's rather minor, so I never do much to address it, and it's always there. Story 8. I'm not quite answering your question. However, many people on my maternal side have terrible temper tantrums. My brother inherited this. I call it the Richardson curse. In kindergarten, I watched my mother go through such a fit and vowed that I would not be like that. I kept my vow. Story 9. Both of my parents are angry people. I tend to raise my voice when I get mad, like my mother. I am working on it. Story 10. Incessant dread. Always dreading the drive, the crowds, and the wait time. It's exhausting, and I have learned the beauty of surrendering. Story 11. Being sedentary has been a challenge for me. None of my parents ever valued sports or fitness, and they did not have hobbies or a varied routine, focusing primarily on television and phone games. I continue to struggle to make changes even at the age of 37. Story 12. I believe my father and I share the same undiagnosed mental illness. We are so functional that it's hardly noticeable, and we can pass as normal individuals. Story 13. My asymmetrical nose looks small like my mom on one side and large like my dad on the other side. Story 14. Hoarding tendencies include taking things in as they come, because you never know what you might need, difficulty sorting items, and not being bothered when things get messy. The messier it is, the higher the chance that if something falls, the outcome will be worse. There is often no cleaning schedule, leading to delays in recycling, donating, or disposing of items that are not outright trash, such as old electronics, dead batteries, glass containers, and outgrown clothes. I consider it an achievement to be able to open every drawer and cabinet door, but it is a simple task that most people do not think about. I doubt many can imagine living in a space with very little usable room. Thankfully, I am not claustrophobic, but sometimes I wonder if my parents would be stricter with themselves if I were, and if they could see how it affects my health in ways they cannot ignore. Story 15. People-pleasing, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, nervous tics, buying things before paying my bills, mild hoarding, depression, anxiety. Other than that, everything else is fine. Story 16. My dad had significant inflammation. My brother and I have weak, sensitive gut microbiomes, which have caused many issues. Mom is doing well at over 85 years old. Story 17. Well, first and foremost, I have a very addictive personality. Both sides have one, so I was negatively affected by it. Story 18. Mental illness has affected both sides of my family for generations. I inherited attention deficit hyperactivity disorder from my mother's side and major depressive disorder from my father's side. Some of my issues are associated with well-known genetic mutations, and I have undergone gene sequencing that indicates I have multiple such mutations. It feels as though I was destined to face these mental health challenges, with no cure in sight unless gene therapy discovers a solution. Story 19. Micromanaging my partner, which I always thought was being helpful, is viewed entirely differently by my husband of 17 years, who sees it as smothering. Unfortunately, my ex-partner of 19 years had a similar view, as did my parents, and he actually relied on me for many small decisions like what to order in a new restaurant. It has been very difficult to change this behavior, but now, when I see it in my family, it drives me crazy. Story 20. My mom has significant commitment issues that she directly passed on to me. She instilled these issues in me. Once I noticed what she was doing during my teenage years, I decided I would be different. Over 20 years later, I am still exactly like her. Story 21. My brain seems to be affected by a lack of intelligence inherited from my parents. My mother contributes an average of -1 intelligence while my father provides 3. Additionally, I have an array of medical issues that restrict my diet, making it difficult to enjoy food as I approach my 30s, a consequence of my parents' genetics. I suspect both of my parents have mental health challenges that they have addressed to some extent, but they have never discussed these issues with me. Story 22. My obsessive-compulsive disorder and anxiety often make me feel like I am always waiting for the other shoe to drop. While this drives me to be highly functional and well-prepared, I wish I could dial it down a bit. Story 23. Having my dad's sense of humor means that I just make dad jokes. I recently started to explore more risque humor, so I'm beginning to differentiate my style from my dad's, but my jokes are still terrible. Story 24. Not having patience in moments that require it. I am much better than when I was a teenager. I am a work in progress working to eliminate the poor habits. This improvement should be completed by the time I take my last breath. Story 25. Some of my mannerisms aren't bad and actually pair well with how I talk and communicate, but I constantly remind myself of both my parents. Getting old is difficult. Story 26. My love of arguments is driving my fiancé crazy, and reasonably so. My mother was constantly seeking arguments throughout my childhood. With me, my stepfather, my father, her ex-husband, and my grandparents. It's a behavior I learned and am having a hard time unlearning. Story 27. My mom had a hard time admitting she was wrong and would lie rather than face consequences for her actions. It took me decades to change that ingrained behavior, but it still appears, usually in my personal life. At work, I have no problem taking responsibility for mistakes, but with my spouse, I often feel judged when I admit to an error. I still find it easier to lie than to acknowledge a mistake. However, I have improved significantly and am much better than I used to be. Story 28. Like my father, who developed it when he got cancer, I have also experienced obsessive-compulsive disorder, particularly related to hygiene. Living with him and taking care of him, I have acquired similar tendencies which worsened during the COVID-19 pandemic. Coupled with my tendency to overthink, it has created a difficult situation. I feel compelled to sanitize my phone to clear my mind. Story 29. I have given too much to people, particularly my mom. Over the past few years, I have healed a lot and changed. I have become very much like my father, detached and unbothered. He is an Aquarius and truly the best dad in the world, no joke. Story 30. I get angry easily and have mood swings, inherited from my father. What makes it worse is that I shout when I am angry, a trait from my mother. Story 31. Purchase impulse control problems. When I have money in hand, I want to spend it on things I desire. I consider myself a consumer. I mostly have it under control and can afford to buy things now, but completely eliminating it would be ideal. Story 32. My dad was a smart guy but a very big liar. My mom often spoke to me about this, and now that I'm a bit older, I realize they were both involved in it. I am trying to move on from this. Story 33. Their hot tempers are challenging. I have better control of mine, but it's a quality I need to monitor, as I can regret it if I'm not careful. Story 34. Anger and yelling occur when I am upset. It took me years to recognize how my behavior during these moments closely correlates with how my mother behaved at home when I was a child and teenager. I am still a work in progress, but at least I can now see the problem. Story 35. Being transactional in relationships is a challenge I constantly confront. I had a parent who believed I owed her simply for existing. When I needed basic support from her, she expected something in return. As a teenager and adult, she even took from me. Thank you, Mom. Story 36. The whole us versus the village mentality, especially regarding friendships and social interactions, can serve as a strong defense strategy to keep oneself safe and protect against being hurt by others. However, I feel like I have missed out on good friendships and opportunities because I am often assuming that others are out to get me or that they are not as genuine as they appear. What I have learned is that most people are generally neutral or kind, and you do not need to have a deep, soul-level connection with everyone to be their friend. Story 37. The impatience of finishing a family event and getting back to my own time to do what I want is challenging. My dad never appeared happy during family events, and I sensed he wanted to be alone, which often meant watching TV or smoking in the garage. At least I am aware of this and actively trying to be present with my kids more often. Story 38. Both my parents have strong work integrity, which means their work is always prioritized. While growing up, this did not directly affect me. However, I am currently unemployed and seeking a job. The pressure to secure a permanent position and define myself by it is overwhelming. This trait of prioritizing work has been passed down to me, and it makes me anxious, especially considering the current economic situation. Story 39. Not wanting to bother anyone has resulted in feeling very lonely. I believe I have an undiagnosed condition because I struggle to follow directions and have difficulty understanding instructions. I also recognize my financial irresponsibility and poor spending habits. Story 40. Perfectionism from my mother essentially ruins everything. Being overly emotional comes from my father. He appears tough, but it is evident that he is very emotional and cries over small things. However, over the past 50 years, he has managed to suppress it. Story 41. For my family, it was abuse. I wouldn't say it is a biological trait, but it is so common in my family that it was usual for women to flee or die. My dad didn't want that for us. When he faced those same behaviors, he left. He didn't like that he had become his father or his brother. It sounds bad, and for years I was angry, but before he came back, he got counseling, cut off toxic ties, and committed to humbling himself repeatedly. He has a lot of shame surrounding this, but I see him as loving us so much that he knew he needed help. He has been an outstanding father and co-parent with my mom. I don't like the part where he left, but he transformed. He shines. Story 42. My mother had a habit of mentioning her ailments in every conversation, often repeating herself to emphasize her point and ensure everyone heard about it. Now I find myself doing the same, repeating myself as if I wasn't heard the first time. It's embarrassing and annoying. Story 43. Always trying to do everything the correct way, adhering to every law and social convention in pretty much all aspects of life. Many people seem to get away with so much, and their lives appear much easier because of it. I wouldn't want to be completely inconsiderate. I enjoy being liked, and my moral compass just wouldn't align with that. However, I think I could overlook a few things without causing real problems, allowing myself a bit more freedom. Story 44. What if thinking causes unnecessary stress? As I find myself continuously worrying about things that could go wrong. I can't help but laugh within 30 seconds of telling a lie. I don't know why, but whenever I lie, I immediately start laughing or begin to laugh when I look the person in the eyes. I know that lying is wrong, but sometimes it feels easier to lie than to reveal a harsh truth. Story 45. Mania and alcoholism. Luckily, I didn't inherit pathological lying from my mother, but I certainly took on the mania from her. My relationship with alcohol is influenced by my father. I've kept it relatively in check, but it's gotten close to getting out of hand. Right now, I am definitely drinking too much, but I find myself in a middle ground between full-blown alcoholism and simply enjoying a couple of beers after work. Story 46. I have a short temper and I tend to blame my kids quickly. I always apologize, but I need to stop assuming the worst. Story 47. My father's issues with physical violence, emotional sensitivity, extreme determination, and bullying tendencies to get what he wants are concerning. My mother struggles with emotional volatility, autism, judgmental tendencies, and excessive meticulousness. They both tend to be overly logical, which led me to regard emotions as a weakness and to dislike myself for being so emotional. I love my parents, but I feel as though I inherited the worst traits from both of them. Story 48. My tendency is to get loud or yell in frustration if something is going on for over 30 minutes. I repeatedly ask for something because I want it done right away, depending on what it is. If I have to ask another 10 to 20 times, giving space between requests, then I become annoyed. Story 49. Being attracted to people who exhibit red flags. I have been single since my last breakup at the end of 2023 and am learning to be more discerning. Story 50. Having a hard time admitting fault or apologizing. My dad is a narcissist, and apologizing is seen as an admission of guilt that exposes me to more criticism. I also feel that I can't bring up things I'm unhappy about unless I am perfect first, as it just opens me up to criticism. I'm working on it, but it runs deep. Story 51. Nasty verbal outbursts during disagreements, usually with my parents. I have been working on all my bad habits and attitudes that I inherited from my parents, but this one still often rears its ugly head. Story 52. I like to think that, at age 62, I have moved away from the selfishness of my parents to become a person who fully considers the needs of others and understands that the world does not revolve around me. Story 53. To be honest, I inherited no character traits from my father, thank goodness. Everything comes from my mother, who is great. That said, I was partially raised by my grandmother and picked up some of her obsessive-compulsive tendencies. It would be nice to let things go once in a while. Story 54. I would love to eliminate anxiety from my mother's side and slow metabolism in women from my father's side. Please, I would actually like to swap. My mother's side is physically thin, and my father's side is mentally strong. Story 55. Being distant from people who don't share my interests or personality is similar to my mother's behavior. My mother and I used to have separate friends with whom we were close, but we both ended up drifting apart from them because our interests did not align, resulting in fewer incentives to meet up. Story 56. I can be stubborn and often talk to myself, especially when something annoys me, and I attribute that to my father. On my mother's side, I can find guidance to stay on the right path. Story 57. I have a cousin who wouldn't visit because her mother is overweight, and she was afraid the tires would melt on the freeway due to the summer heat. Anxiety is prevalent in my family. Story 58. I don't know if it's necessarily a character trait, but my mom is undiagnosed with bipolar disorder, and I have bipolar disorder type 1. It is challenging. Considering how terrible my dad was with money, it is no wonder I am often broke. Story 59. Lack of planning ability can be frustrating. For example, choosing a vacation destination often takes a long time. Once a location is decided, we tend to go there and improvise. In contrast, when I travel with my in-laws, we have activities and meals planned and booked in advance. We're able to access more popular attractions because we made reservations 3 to 6 months ahead of time. Story 60. Being poor. Not truly poor, but poor enough that I will always have to worry about money in a real, day-to-day way. Story 61. I realized I'm not paranoid recently. Whenever I leave my hometown, I feel sane. It's strange, but I'm pretty sure most of my mental health issues come from being around paranoid people with deep trust issues and post-traumatic stress disorder. I love my family, but it's not good for me to be here. Story 62. Being last minute for many things is typical for my dad, while my mom keeps that in check for both of us. I am grateful that I did not inherit his tendency to be late, especially when it comes to travel. I am the type of person who arrives at the airport 6 hours early when traveling alone, while my dad can hear final call and then decide to go to the restroom. Story 63. My mother has a wide waist, and I inherited that from her. It's not a problem as long as I stay relatively lean, but I will never achieve a pronounced V-taper because of my wider waist. Story 64. None, actually. It has made me who I am, both good and bad. But if I had to choose, it would be my addiction to gambling. While I very rarely gamble, I think it manifests in other ways for me. Story 65. One parent is very frugal, while the other is spontaneous with money. Unfortunately, I inherited the spontaneous trait, which I dislike. I am trying to learn how to be more frugal now. Story 66. Not a personal character trait, but something I would like to have taken away is the unresolved trauma from having an absent alcoholic father. Story 67. The multiple mental illnesses affected them both, each possessing different debilitating conditions that combine to create the worst person imaginable. Story 68. My need to be on time drives me crazy when people aren't ready to go when I am. I set a time to arrive somewhere, and I expect to be there at that time. On the other hand, there are things I'm not letting go of. Putting items in the walkway was unacceptable in my household because my dad grew up with a brother who had a disability. If there was anything on the floor near a walkway, you were in big trouble. To this day, I lose my composure if someone thinks the floor is a suitable spot to store things, and I trip over it. Shelves were made for a reason. Use them. Story 69. I have a better temper than my father, but he still had a bad temper. I definitely do as well. It was much worse when I was a teenager and a young adult, but I would prefer it to be completely absent from me. Story 70. I feel uncomfortable when others see me doing something I'm not good at. I dislike having anyone witness my emotions or worry about me. I am working on the first issue. I have allowed my children to see me attempting things I struggle with. I disliked it but kept my feelings to myself. I don't want to create that same discomfort for them. I tell my children it's okay to express emotions, but I am still not comfortable with others seeing me be emotional. Story 71. Probably frustration. I don't have anger issues in the sense that I throw things or punch walls, but I often feel unnecessarily irritated by many things that, in hindsight, aren't a big deal. Story 72. I'm stubborn like both my parents. I wish I was less upset about how they ended up divorced without discussing it with us. Story 73. Those individuals made me feel alive without even asking first. I would love to reverse that impulsive decision of theirs. Story 74. Not apologizing. I just set myself on fire. Growing up, nobody apologized in my family, and when you did, it was like, sorry is not going to fix this. Story 75. My mother's negative emotional expressions can be challenging to navigate. Thankfully, I am self-aware enough not to express myself in her way, which often involves screaming and punishing. Instead, I can calmly talk through situations. However, it is frustrating to deal with a situation maturely while my mind creates numerous lines of inner dialogue. I find it even more difficult when I struggle to separate my emotions and insecurities from those of others. Story 76. Addiction is inherited from my father. I am almost 17 and have never had more than a capful of tequila that my aunt gave me to try. I am honestly scared to have anything more than that because I come from a long line of alcoholics, and I do not wish to become one. Story 77. Both of them are rather selfish people in their own ways. My mom doesn't mean to be, but sometimes it's clear she acts on a whim and only realizes there are interpersonal consequences when someone explicitly tells her how she made a mistake. My dad tries his best to think of others and be a good listener, but during emotional conversations, he often ends up feeling hurt by the situation, even if it was explicitly his fault and affected someone else. I definitely notice myself falling into the same patterns sometimes, so I try very hard to consider others' feelings before making big decisions and to focus on the people in my life when they come to me with a problem. It's a work in progress, but so is everything, I guess. Story 78. Oh, that's easy. The vicious streak. I work very hard at being a kind, generous, and loving person. But if you cross me, my first instinct is to rip out your spine through your navel. Story 79. My addictive personality depends on which parents we are talking about, biological or legal guardians. The addictive traits come from my biological parents. If we consider my legal guardians, They have made me a perfectionist. I frustrate myself with the need for everything to be perfect. It requires so much time and effort, and since nothing is ever truly perfect, it often feels like a complete waste of time. Story 80. My father blames my mother when she does not do something the way he wants. She cooked for him, but the food was not amazing. He calls her terrible, even though he never cooks. If she does not pay a bill correctly, he blames her, despite the fact that he has never paid a bill in his life. Sadly, I share the same trait where I feel the urge to blame others for not meeting my expectations, even though it is their choice to do so. I could often do these things myself, and in many cases I should. Story 81. Hoarding tendencies and anger recall. If I am recounting an incident that really upset me, I feel just as upset while telling the story as I did the day it happened, which I learned from my dad. A dismissive attitude towards people who have angered me came from my mom. It was very much like, "Oh, that's who you really are? Okay, goodbye." No further discussion was needed. Story 82. My mom has a habit of trying to answer questions before they are fully asked. Unfortunately, I picked up on this habit, and I have been struggling to find a balance between not allowing myself to be talked over, which happens often as a woman in a male-dominated field, and not preemptively answering anticipated questions. It requires a great deal of self-awareness in the moment to stop myself from interrupting. The trait of feeling that a thought must be shared before it is lost does not help either. Story 83. My sensitivity when it comes to my emotions is challenging. I know it's okay for boys to cry, but I shouldn't cry every time my mom reprimands me. Most of the time, I cry even though I don't feel sad to begin with. Why is that? Story 84. A general lack of conflict resolution skills was evident. They were articulate enough, but often misjudged the weight of the moment, failing to ask meaningful follow-up questions or engage in discussions about the issue. This may have been a characteristic of being a middle child, which is not a concern for most people. Story 85. I have a habit of biting my nails. I'm unsure about my father's side of the family as I don't know him, but from my mother's side, I can describe her as stonewalling. She has little emotional range and awareness with a very tough mindset. She either yelled and called names or would shut down completely. I found myself doing the same and sought therapy for it. Story 86. There are too many options to choose from. I am the only one in my entire extended family who is obese, just like my mother was. She is now on medication and has become quite slim. I cannot take those because I am a type 1 diabetic. Another challenge I face is depression. I believe my life would have been very different without it. I have finally found effective medications and am doing much better, but my teenage years, 20s, and 30s could have been filled with joy if I had been more aware. These are my fundamental character traits at this point. I am overweight and somewhat unhappy, and that is how people perceive me. Story 87. The tendency to never acknowledge the conflict that occurred the previous day is prevalent in my family. My parents argue daily. It is rare to see them not in conflict. They interact the next day without recognizing their disagreements. Now, my older siblings and I exhibit the same behavior. When we argue, we do not address the situation afterward. I realize this is an unhealthy way of managing conflicts within the family. However, starting that conversation is challenging because I feel my opinions are insignificant in this family. Story 88. Being sarcastic can have negative effects on relationships. I witnessed my sister's marriage fail because she constantly put her husband down with sarcastic comments. Story 89. I wish I had more characteristics of my father than my mother. I am the odd one out. I'm the youngest, and by the time I came along, my dad had even less time to spend at home. My siblings were able to be around my dad far more and, therefore, have easygoing and personable qualities. They also had each other, being so close in age, whereas I was sort of a surprise. They don't try too hard socially, while I always feel awkward and out of place around others. Because I was around my mother more, I have an ornery nature at times. My fuse can be short, and I can become easily irritated. I'm always leery of people. I am also very pessimistic, seeing the bad in everything. I feel like maybe she was or is depressed, and I might also be. I feel this way because I know when I am being unreasonable, but I feel like I can't control my emotions. I am worried that I might also pass this down to my children, as I have to be very conscious not to blow up in the way my mother did with me. Can all be very frustrating. Story 90. I have my dad's temper, and I have been trying my whole adult life to keep it in check and get rid of it, both by myself and through therapy. I dislike getting angry quickly, but it happens to me often. I'm working on it, I swear. Story 91. I am working very hard on it right now, but I have been yelled at constantly about everything. It is such an ingrained reaction that is difficult to break. Story 92. My parents were short. I am of medium height but not tall. I married a tall woman, and my 2 sons are tall. Problem solved. Story 93. I would let go of my attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. The same goes for people-pleasing. Perhaps I just need a hard reset at that point. It's better than my mother's schizophrenia any day. Story 94. I recognized my mother's overindulgence. She had no healthy boundaries with food or shopping, and I have had to learn the hard way as an adult. Story 95. My mother's tit-for-tat, eye-for-an-eye principle. When I was a child, my mother would tell me I could only invite kids to my birthday party if I had been invited to theirs previously. I am also quite incapable of forgiveness. It takes a lot for me to get there. But if you have wounded my trust too much, I will never allow you back in my life and will hold a grudge indefinitely. I experienced something rather traumatic, and my friend was there. We promised never to tell anyone, but a week later she was making obvious jokes about it. I confronted her after many attempts to gently ask her to stop. She exploded and spread rumors to everyone we knew about what had happened. My other friend and I began to ignore her after that. Not in direct conversations, but we stopped hanging out, initiating conversations, and generally provided only short responses when necessary. In turn, she started telling people we bullied her for ignoring her. There was an attempt to talk it out about a year later, but she began with the condition that we all take responsibility for our parts in it. I simply stopped hanging out with her and talking to her. I did not feel the need to take responsibility for something I did not do. It has been 8 years, and if I were to hear now that she fell on the street, I would not feel concerned. I'm not saying I would take pleasure in it, but I wouldn't feel sympathy for her. Story 96. As much as I appreciate the advantages of having attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, such as being imaginative, passionate, and able to hyperfocus on things I enjoy, I truly dislike the drawbacks. I often struggle to engage in tasks I do not want to do. I am prone to substance dependence like alcohol and overeating for dopamine, and I constantly battle anxiety and depression stemming from chronically low dopamine levels. The anxiety and depression aspect of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is something my mother experiences, as she is also diagnosed with the condition. My father is not diagnosed, but his addiction to alcohol, need for alone time, and intense focus on activities he enjoys make me wonder if he might have it as well. And now I find myself dealing with all of these challenges. Story 97. Being in disaster mode all the time and immediately jumping to anger and projection when things don't initially go as planned can be challenging. I've made significant progress through psychotherapy, specifically cognitive processing therapy, but it still affects me at times, and it can be difficult. Story 98. My mother's abrupt way of speaking can be blunt. I prefer to get to the point quickly, but it can come across poorly. I appreciate her temper, though. Story 99. Low self-image. My mother had a very low self-image of herself, and I have struggled with that for years. It was especially tough during my teenage years and 20s. Even decades later, I often have internal dialogues. Story 100. I don't remember the actual name of the song, but it was a few years ago. It was about a hula hoop, and I found it quite silly. Story 101. We worry too much about our guests not having enough food to eat during our dinners. We always end up with tons of leftovers. Story 102. Social anxiety. My mom has always been quiet and rarely talks to others. She gets anxious when she has to speak to people. I inherited these traits and I dislike them. I wish I could communicate with others more easily. Story 103. As soon as we get to our destination, I need to know what time we are leaving. My dad was the same way, and it drives me crazy. It's annoying that I have become like that too. Story 104. Putting everyone else before myself is a recurring pattern. I am willing to go out of my way for others, even if it creates difficulties for me. While this may not always be a negative quality, consistently prioritizing others can lead to challenges. Story 105. Forgetting to hold space for myself and communicate my feelings is something I inherited from my dad. I express my emotions more freely than he did, but what is the point of doing so if there is nothing beneath the surface? Part of the reason his marriage to my mom failed was his refusal to be emotionally present for his wife and children, believing that being a good provider was sufficient. I understand that I may struggle financially my entire life, so I often tell my wife, I'm fine, even when I'm not. Story 106. Not a character trait but a genetic trait. Cancer would be a significant trait not to inherit from both of my parents. I've been assured that breast cancer, from my mother, and liver cancer, from my father, are not high on the list of genetically transferable cancers. I've had an uncle, 3 cousins, and my mother die of cancer on one side, and 2 uncles, 2 cousins, 1 aunt, and my father on the other side. Am I supposed to believe my doctor when he tells me that I do not face a significant likelihood of developing cancer compared to anyone else? I feel like I am looking down both barrels. Story 107. I come from a long line of men who cannot tolerate authority. Worse still, my son has oppositional defiant disorder. I think there is some of it in all of us spanning generations. My grandfather, whom I never met, was court-martialed for threatening to harm his commanding officer, and it has been downhill ever since. Story 108. Travel anxiety has been a significant issue for me. My dad traveled frequently for work, and I always noticed he was anxious around his travel dates. Now, I find myself in the same situation, nervous and often traveling for work. Story 109. Poor conflict resolution skills are evident in both approaches. One may either shut down or react aggressively to criticism, making it challenging to overcome. Story 110. Passivity and resentment. My immediate family tends to struggle with boundaries and healthy assertiveness. We either avoid conflict and deny our anger, or we explode because someone else didn't read our minds. We also have a tendency to endure situations we dislike, stewing in misery. I am learning to break that cycle. I do not want to be older and bitter, surrounded by toxic and unfulfilling relationships, because I did not ask for or pursue what I wanted. It can be excruciating to initiate difficult conversations or endure others' anger or disappointment, but in the long run, it is worth it. Ultimately, it is kind to others as well. Story 111. My entire family on my father's side has a significant issue with alcohol abuse, while my mother's side struggles with gambling addiction. Story 112. I feel uncomfortable when I am teased inaccurately. I can handle joking based on true information, but if the joke is based on embellishment or inaccuracy, I feel the need to correct it, which often ruins the moment. This makes me seem overly sensitive, a perception I would rather avoid. But I suppose I am. Story 113. It would be really nice if I wasn't physically compelled to stockpile jars, boxes, and containers of all kinds. I never use them. I am aware that I never use them. And yet, what if I need that box later? Story 114. Bad temper, getting angry quickly, irritability. I am trying to control it. Lately, I think I am doing better, but who knows? Story 115. Assume the worst or be ready for anything bad. Instead of bringing anxiety, it makes it nearly impossible to open up and be vulnerable. You cannot get hurt if you're never vulnerable. At this point, I am not even sure what it would feel like. Story 116. My father was inappropriately dismissive and elitist. I dislike myself when I notice I am slipping into that behavior. It is a behavior I learned and must fully unlearn. Story 117. My dad constantly repeats things he thinks are silly that my sister, mother, or I have said in a mocking voice, and I have always disliked it. However, sometimes I catch myself doing it without realizing. It is definitely one of the worst things I do. Story 118. seeing the good in people and wanting to help or ease their pain, even after they have hurt me and caused unnecessary heartache. Thank you, Mom. Story 119. She didn't provide much guidance or advice while parenting me. I didn't learn many things from her. As a result, I am currently struggling to teach my son with grace and patience. Story 120. Laziness and untidiness are traits I inherited from my father. Additionally, I struggle with managing money, which also comes from him. It's strange because he was only a small part of my life, and I am not aware of having inherited anything from my mother. Story 121. Detachment. I know I should probably resolve it, but it feels like my kind of hug, a hug where no one touches me. Story 122. Being judgmental. My parents are very critical and judgmental about everyone and everything, and it has rubbed off on me. Story 123. I'm annoyed by how much people ask me to repeat things or speak more clearly. It's a habit I picked up from childhood. My mother was always a soft speaker and would mumble a lot, sometimes under her breath. It is something that my sisters and I adopted as normal. I'm trying to work on this and speak up more, as well as articulate my words. Story 124. Having narcissistic tendencies. I don't think I'm a full-blown narcissist, but I can see some tendencies. Story 125. My grandmother grew up during the Great Depression when food was scarce. As a result, when they earned a better living, they began overfeeding their children. This mentality was passed down from my mother to me, and I have struggled with it for most of my life. To this day, it is very difficult for me to let go of the mindset of clean your plate, even if it means you might feel sick. Story 126. Right now, it's working too hard. We have positioned ourselves well for life, but I want to scale back now and enjoy our home and children. My father worked throughout our entire childhood. I do not want that. Story 127. My mom can hear every tiny issue with her car, no matter how small or insignificant it is. Somehow, I inherited this ability as well. You would think this is a blessing, not a curse, but it feels like a curse. Story 128. The key takeaway from my parents was to avoid assuming any of their character traits. My current girlfriend comes from 3 generations where every perspective is based on the fear of what could happen. Story 129. Sometimes I tell a story without realizing that I make parts of it up, so I have to catch myself and start over. My mom does the same thing, and my dad rarely tells the truth or gives me the whole story. It's a challenging combination. Story 130. My dad is a poor spender. Thank goodness I take after my mom when it comes to saving and investing. Story 131. My father insisted on playing the devil's advocate for everything. While I am now skilled at considering both sides of a situation and holding 2 truths, I find that I have become somewhat too good at it. I realize I can be just as annoying as he is. Story 132. I inherited the enabler trait from my mother. I tend to enable myself in many ways I shouldn't, but it's difficult to stop because I am accustomed to taking the easy route. Essentially, I lack discipline and struggle with self-discipline without a solid foundation. I still make an effort, but I often fail because it is easier to let myself slack off, postpone tasks, and avoid responsibilities. It is truly irresponsible in many ways. Story 133. Whenever I notice any of my mother's habits in myself, it terrifies me that I might end up as vile a human being as she is. It makes me want to end it all so I don't hurt anyone I care about in the future. Story 134. It's not a character trait, but it definitely affected my character. I would prefer not to have been born with a health disease. Story 135. My mom is very anxious, and my dad is very relaxed. As a result, I feel anxious but lack the motivation to do anything to improve the situation. Story 136. Perfectionism, which leads to anxiety, comes from both sides. One thing that really helped me is the realization that there is no such thing as universally perfect. Everyone has a different view of what perfect is. The only time the word perfect can or should be applied to something is when absolutely everyone is satisfied with it. Very few things, in the grand scheme of things, have been able to achieve this, and it's unlikely that anything I could ever do will ever be perfect. As long as I do the best that I can and know that I did my best, that will have to be enough. Story 137. The anger is all I knew growing up. If anything went wrong, I experienced extreme anger. I don't beat my kids like I was beaten, but my yelling is absolutely unacceptable. I have been working hard and taking my medication to try to change it, but I honestly can't tell you what I am supposed to replace it with in my reaction. I have come so far, but I still have a long way to go. Story 138. I have difficulty comforting people in times of need. I often dismiss their need for comfort and try to suggest solutions when all they really require is someone to talk to. Story 139. Holding a grudge is something I inherited from my mother. Fool me once, and you're dead to me. However, I am growing. I've accepted that if someone wrongs you, it can sometimes be rectified depending on the situation, but the friendship will never be what it once was. Story 140. My family tends to procrastinate and often runs late. We have improved by creating to-do lists and reminders, but it is still a daily struggle. We will keep pushing. Story 141. I always try to make others comfortable and then wonder why I feel burnt out and unfulfilled. Story 142. I was raised to believe that if you are not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. My family is gone, and therefore my team is gone as well. My in-laws do not agree, and it is quite uncomfortable. They are completely against rocking the boat and take pride in that stance. Story 143. My dad and I are both quite introverted, so when we are at events with large groups of people, we tend to just hang around until they end. Story 144. My father has a really big ego and is incredibly stubborn. It's quite obnoxious. I've now realized that I am the exact copy of my father. Now I find myself being the obnoxious one. Story 145. I get upset easily. I inherited my temper from my dad, who has a history of becoming quite angry and lashing out. Story 146. My mom always starts yelling at any minor inconvenience, and I noticed that I slowly started doing it too with the people I am comfortable with. I'm really trying to change that because I always got so mad at my mom for that. Story 147. Being overly accommodating can lead to being taken advantage of. While generosity and kindness are admirable qualities, they may sometimes blind individuals to how others perceive their actions. Even when faced with exploitation, some continue to act selflessly. Story 148. Being a loner. Both my parents do not have many friends and would prefer to stay inside rather than socialize. This made me comfortable with being alone myself, most days at least. Story 149. From my mom, I inherited anxiety, depression, insecurity, and control issues. From my dad, I got the trait of being a hopeless romantic. Clearly, they are a match made in heaven. Story 150. My dad's tendency to be overly accommodating can sometimes lead to people taking advantage of him. Both of us have been working on that. We are the outcasts of the family and support each other, even though we live across the country. Story 151. I'm not sure how to answer this. Initially, I thought it was a genetic issue related to my cystic acne, thanks to my dad. Then I realized you meant something inherited through conditioning, and I tried to consider any bad habits I may have. The only thing I can think of is laughing at really inappropriate times. My mom has a love-hate relationship with my dad and me because we have dark humor, so we have to whisper our jokes in a large family setting. She says we sound like high school girls giggling and gossiping. Story 152. I would like to eliminate the pessimism that I believe I inherited from my father. Whenever I face a challenge, I always expect the worst possible outcome first. As a result, I put a lot of pressure on myself and sometimes give up easily. Although it makes me somewhat well prepared for challenges, the negative impacts are quite clear. The constant worry and pressure often leave me feeling exhausted and less confident. I would prefer to view situations from a more positive perspective, be more optimistic, and believe that good things can also happen. This way, I can enjoy the process more and feel more motivated to pursue my goals instead of being held back by this pessimistic trait all the time. Story 153. I am adopted, so I believe in nurture over nature, but I am a planner like my mom. For trips, I plan every single detail. My sister, who is also adopted from different parents, is just like my dad and does not plan at all. Story 154. My temper has been a challenge I've worked hard on for most of my adult life, and I have it under good control now. However, it is still present, and I don't enjoy feeling that way. Story 155. The paternal line of my family, including my brothers, our father, and so on, all share one common trait. I don't really know what it should be called, but I refer to it as motivation by explosion. We experience very strong emotions, and combined with a history of harshly suppressing them, we often appear calm and collected. However, we constantly build up stress since we never developed a healthy way to cope with it. The only release we find is through impulsive actions that can be quite dramatic. We are not all the same. My older brother has channeled his explosive energy into his career, which has brought him success, though he struggles with financial management. My younger brother and I are similar. I became obsessed with self-improvement before transitioning to art, while his journey has been the opposite. My father focused on enhancing his image and pursuing fame, and my grandfather aimed to be the smartest man in town. At one point, he may have achieved that. I work hard and can accomplish a lot when I muster the motivation, but most of the time, I procrastinate. It often feels like I need to be angry, desperate, or generally happy while doing something to get through my workday, which can feel precarious, especially given how challenging it is for me to find a job in the first place. This entire situation is something I could do without. Also, regarding the child abuse I mentioned, that cycle will not continue. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.